The summer of 1981 arrived in Cardville, Missouri the way it always did, slowly, with heat that seemed to rise from the earth itself and settle over the small town like a warm blanket. The streets were lined with oak trees that had watched generations grow up beneath their branches, and on quiet mornings, you could hear the sound of screen doors slamming shut from blocks away. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where children rode their bicycles without helmets, and where the idea of real danger felt like something that happened in other towns, to other families, in other lives. Katie Reynolds was 6 years old that summer, with strawberry blonde hair that her mother, Susan, brushed every morning into 2 neat pigtails. She had a gap between her front teeth that made her smile seem even wider, and she collected ladybugs in glass jars that she kept on the windowsill of her bedroom. Her father, Tom, worked at the grain elevator on the edge of town, coming home each evening with dust on his work boots and stories about the farmers he'd helped that day. They lived in a small house on Maple Street, painted white with blue shutters, with a tire swing hanging from the oak tree in the front yard. Before we continue, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy stories of survival and hope like this one, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd appreciate it too. On the morning of June 13th, Katie woke up early. The sun was barely above the horizon, casting long shadows across her bedroom floor. She could hear her mother already moving around in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of breakfast being prepared, the clink of dishes, the whistle of the kettle, the soft hum of the radio playing country music. Katie dressed herself in her favorite outfit, denim shorts with embroidered flowers on the pockets and a yellow t-shirt that had a rainbow across the front. She pulled on her white sneakers, the ones with the Velcro straps, and bounded down the stairs with the energy that only a 6-year-old on summer vacation could possess. Susan Reynolds looked up when Katie entered the kitchen, her face breaking into a smile. "Well, good morning, sunshine," she said, setting a plate of pancakes on the table. "Can I go to Amy's house after breakfast?" Katie asked, climbing onto her chair and reaching for the syrup. Amy Patterson was her best friend, lived 3 houses down, and the 2 girls had spent nearly every day together since school let out 2 weeks earlier. "Did you ask Amy's mom?" Susan replied, pouring orange juice into Katie's cup. "Yes, yesterday. She said we could play in the sprinkler if it gets hot." Susan nodded, glancing out the window at the cloudless sky. "It's going to be a scorcher today. Make sure you wear your hat. And don't forget to come home for lunch." 1 o'clock, Katie. "Not 1:30, not 2 o'clock. 1 o'clock sharp." "I will, Mommy. I promise." Tom Reynolds came down the stairs already dressed in his work clothes, his hair still damp from the shower. He ruffled Katie's hair as he passed, earning a giggle from his daughter. "Morning, Pumpkin. What are you and Amy getting into today?" "Just playing," Katie said through a mouthful of pancake. "Maybe we'll catch butterflies." "Stay where Mrs. Patterson can see you," Tom said, his tone gentle but firm. "Don't wander off." "I won't, Daddy." It was just after 8 o'clock when Katie kissed her parents goodbye and skipped out the front door, her small pink backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Inside the backpack was a juice box, a granola bar her mother had packed, and her favorite stuffed rabbit named Mr. Whiskers. Susan watched from the doorway as Katie made her way down the sidewalk, her pigtails swaying with each step. The morning was already warm, and the cicadas had begun their endless song in the trees. "Be good," Susan called out. Katie turned and waved, her smile bright and carefree. "I will." Those would be the last words Susan Reynolds would hear her daughter speak for 28 years. Katie arrived at Amy Patterson's house at 8:15. Amy was already outside, wearing a swimsuit under her clothes, eager to get into the sprinkler. The 2 girls played in the front yard for the next hour, running through the water, their laughter carrying down the quiet street. Betty Patterson, Amy's mother, watched them from the porch, occasionally calling out reminders to stay on the grass or to share the hose. She remembers feeling grateful for the peace of that morning, for the simple joy of watching children play on a summer day. At 9:30, Betty went inside to answer a phone call from her sister. The conversation lasted about 15 minutes. During that time, Katie and Amy decided they wanted to go to the corner store, just 2 blocks away, to buy candy. They'd done it before, always together, always with permission. But this time, Betty was on the phone. Amy ran inside to ask, and Betty, distracted by her conversation, waved them away. "Not right now, sweetie," she said, her hand covering the receiver. "Maybe later." But the girls didn't hear the word no. They heard maybe. And to 6-year-olds, maybe was close enough to yes. They started walking. Two little girls in summer clothes, heading down the sidewalk with quarters clutched in their small hands. They made it to the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, where they had to cross to reach the store. Amy stopped at the curb, looking both ways like her parents had taught her. But when she turned around, Katie wasn't beside her anymore. "Katie," Amy called out, looking back down the street. There was no response. The sidewalk was empty. The street was quiet. Katie had simply vanished, in the space of a few seconds, in broad daylight, on a residential street in a town where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Amy felt the first flutter of panic in her chest. She ran back down the sidewalk, calling Katie's name, thinking maybe her friend had decided to go back to the house. But Katie wasn't on the sidewalk. She wasn't in any of the yards. She wasn't anywhere Amy could see. By the time Amy ran, crying, back to her house, barely 10 minutes had passed. Betty Patterson dropped the phone and ran outside, her heart already racing. She searched the yard, the street, the neighbor's property. She called out Katie's name until her voice went hoarse. And then, with shaking hands, she called the Reynolds house. Susan answered on the second ring. "Hello. Susan, it's Betty. I don't know how to say this." Katie and Amy were playing, and I looked away for just a minute, and now I can't find Katie. I've looked everywhere. She's not here. There's a specific kind of silence that follows words like those. It's not empty. It's full of every terrible possibility rushing in at once, filling the space where certainty used to be. Susan felt her legs go weak, her hand gripping the kitchen counter to steady herself. "What do you mean you can't find her?" "She was right there, Susan. Right there in front of the house. And then she was gone. I'm so sorry. I'm calling the police right now." Susan dropped the phone and ran. She didn't grab her purse, didn't lock the door, didn't think about anything except getting to her daughter. She ran the 3 houses down to the Patterson home, her breath coming in gasps, her mind refusing to accept what she was hearing. Tom was still at work. She'd have to call him next. But first, she had to find Katie. Katie had to be somewhere close. Children didn't just disappear, but in Cardville, Missouri, on June 13, 1981, one did. And what followed would become one of the most haunting and ultimately hopeful missing persons cases in American history. A 28-year journey from terror to reunion, from loss to an impossible homecoming that no one saw coming. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what that morning was supposed to be. You have to see it the way Susan and Tom Reynolds saw it. As just another summer day, ordinary and safe, filled with the kind of moments that parents don't think to memorize because they assume there will be thousands more just like it. June 13, 1981, began at 6:47 a.m. when Susan Reynolds woke to the sound of birdsong coming through the open window of the bedroom. The air was already warm, carrying with it the promise of the kind of heat that would have children begging to stay in the sprinkler all afternoon. She slipped out of bed quietly, letting Tom sleep a little longer, and padded down the stairs in her bare feet. By 7:15, the kitchen smelled like coffee and butter. Susan moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, setting the kettle on the stove, pulling eggs and milk from the refrigerator, reaching for the mixing bowl she'd used 1,000 times before. The radio on the counter was tuned to the local station, playing a mix of country music and cheerful morning banter from the hosts. Outside, the world was just beginning to wake up. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A car engine turned over. The sun climbed higher, painting everything gold. At 7:32, Susan heard the familiar creak of the floorboards above her head. Katie was awake. Most mornings, Katie would come downstairs slowly, still rubbing sleep from her eyes, her hair a tangled mess that would require patient brushing. But not today. Today, Susan could hear the quick patter of small feet, the sound of drawers opening and closing, the unmistakable energy of a child who had woken up with plans. By 7:45, Tom was awake too. He came down the stairs already dressed in his work clothes, faded jeans, and a button-up shirt with the grain elevator logo stitched on the pocket. His hair was still damp from the shower, and he smelled like Old Spice and soap. "Morning," he said, kissing Susan on the cheek before pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Morning. Katie's already up and moving. I think she's planning to spend the whole day at Amy's." Tom smiled, the kind of smile that came easily to him in those days. As long as she doesn't track mud through the house, I'm happy. At 7:52, Katie appeared in the kitchen doorway. She'd dressed herself, something she'd been insisting on doing all summer, and she looked proud of her choices. Denim shorts with tiny embroidered flowers on the pockets, a yellow t-shirt with a bright rainbow stretched across the front, and her white sneakers with the Velcro straps that made a satisfying ripping sound when she pulled them open. Her hair was still loose, falling past her shoulders in waves that would need Susan's attention before she left the house. "Well, good morning, sunshine," Susan said, setting a plate of pancakes on the table. The pancakes were golden brown, still steaming, with butter melting into pools on the surface. Katie climbed onto her chair, her legs swinging beneath the table. "Can I go to Amy's house after breakfast?" "Did you ask Amy's mom?" Susan replied, reaching for the orange juice in the refrigerator. "Yes, yesterday. She said we could play in the sprinkler if it gets hot." Susan poured juice into Katie's plastic cup, the one with the cartoon flowers on the side, and nodded. "It's going to be a scorcher today. Make sure you wear your hat. And don't forget to come home for lunch." She set the juice down and looked at her daughter, making sure Katie was paying attention. 1 o'clock, Katie. Not 1:30, not 2 o'clock. 1 o'clock sharp. Katie nodded, her mouth already full of pancake. "I will, Mommy. I promise." It was the kind of promise children make easily, without understanding that promises are meant to be kept. It was also a promise that would echo in Susan's mind for decades, a small, innocent commitment that would never be fulfilled. Tom came down the stairs at 8:03, his work boots making heavy sounds on the wood. He ruffled Katie's hair as he passed, earning a giggle from his daughter. "Morning, Pumpkin. What are you and Amy getting into today?" "Just playing," Katie said, syrup glistening on her chin. "Maybe we'll catch butterflies." Tom poured himself a second cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching his daughter with the quiet contentment of a man who believed his life was exactly as it should be. "Stay where Mrs. Patterson can see you," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "Don't wander off." "I won't, Daddy." After breakfast, Susan brushed Katie's hair at the kitchen table, working through the tangles with careful strokes while Katie sat still, mostly still, and talked about the games she and Amy were planning. 2 neat pigtails emerged, secured with elastic bands that had small plastic flowers attached. Katie touched them, pleased, and then ran upstairs to grab her backpack. The backpack was small and pink with a cartoon character on the front, something Katie had picked out herself at the start of the school year. At 8:12, she came back downstairs with it slung over one shoulder, already packed with the essentials of a 6-year-old's day trip. Inside, a juice box, the kind with the tiny straw attached to the side. A granola bar wrapped in foil, packed by Susan in case Katie got hungry before lunch. And Mr. Whiskers, a stuffed rabbit with one ear that flopped more than the other, a companion Katie had owned since she was 3. Mr. Whiskers went everywhere. At 8:17, Katie stood at the front door, ready to leave. Susan knelt down to adjust one of the pigtails that had already started to slip. "Be good," she said, pressing a kiss to Katie's forehead. "I will," Tom called out from the kitchen. "Love you, Pumpkin." "Love you too, Daddy." And then Katie was out the door, the screen slamming shut behind her with that familiar summer sound. Her pink backpack bounced against her shoulders as she skipped down the front steps and onto the sidewalk. The tire swing swayed gently in the breeze as she passed it. The sun was already climbing higher, and the heat was starting to press down on the town like a weight. Susan stood in the doorway, watching until Katie reached the Hendersons' house, the one between theirs and the Pattersons', and then she turned back inside. There were dishes to wash, laundry to fold, a phone call to return. The ordinary tasks of an ordinary day. It was 8:22 a.m. Katie reached Amy Patterson's house at 8:24. Amy was already outside, wearing a swimsuit under a t-shirt and shorts, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. The 2 girls squealed when they saw each other, even though they'd spent the entire previous day together. That was the nature of best friendships at 6 years old. Every reunion felt monumental, every separation unbearable. "Can we do the sprinkler?" Amy asked, already running toward the side of the house where the hose was coiled. "Let me ask my mom," Katie said, dropping her backpack on the porch. Betty Patterson appeared in the doorway, a dish towel in her hands. She was a woman in her early 30s with kind eyes and a patient demeanor that made her a favorite among the neighborhood children. "Morning, Katie. You two planning to get soaked today? Can we?" Both girls asked in unison. Betty laughed. "Sure, but stay in the front yard where I can see you. And don't spray each other in the face." For the next hour, Katie and Amy ran through the sprinkler, their laughter carrying down the quiet street. The water was cold against their sun-warmed skin, and they took turns jumping over the spray, shrieking when it caught them off guard. Betty watched from the porch, occasionally glancing up from the magazine she was reading to make sure both girls were still in sight. At 9:17, she called out a reminder. "Stay on the grass, girls. Don't run into the street." "We won't," they called back, already chasing each other in circles. By 9:30, both girls were starting to get hungry. They'd been playing hard, and the granola bar in Katie's backpack was calling to them. But something better occurred to them. The corner store, just 2 blocks away, had penny candy. If they each had a quarter, they could get a whole bag. "Let's go to the store," Amy said, her eyes lighting up. Katie hesitated. "We have to ask your mom." "I will. Wait here." Amy ran up the porch steps and into the house. The screen door slapped shut behind her. Inside, she could hear her mother's voice. Betty was on the phone in the kitchen, talking to someone, her tone animated and distracted. "Mom," Amy called out. Betty glanced at her daughter, the phone pressed to her ear, and waved a hand absently. "Not right now, sweetie. Maybe later." Amy heard maybe and later, but not right now. To a 6-year-old, that sounded close enough to permission. She ran back outside, where Katie was waiting. "She said maybe later," Amy reported. Katie frowned slightly. "Is that yes?" Amy shrugged. "I think so. Come on." At 9:34 a.m., 2 little girls started walking down Maple Street, their sneakers making soft sounds on the warm concrete. Katie's pink backpack was still on the Pattersons' porch, forgotten in the excitement of the candy mission. Mr. Whiskers sat inside, waiting for a return that would never come. The street was quiet. Most people were at work or inside, escaping the climbing heat. The cicadas buzzed in the trees, their song rising and falling in waves. Katie and Amy walked side by side, quarters clutched in their small hands, discussing the important matter of whether to get gummy bears or lollipops. They reached the corner of Maple and 3rd Street at 9:37. Amy stopped at the curb, just like her parents had taught her. She looked left. She looked right. She looked left again. The street was empty. "Okay, it's clear," Amy said, preparing to step off the curb. But when she turned to grab Katie's hand, Katie wasn't there. The sidewalk behind her was empty. The street was silent. There was no scream, no sound of struggle, no indication that anything had happened at all. Katie Reynolds had simply vanished, erased from the world in a span of seconds that no one witnessed, in a town where everyone thought they knew exactly who belonged and who didn't. Amy called out her friend's name, confusion giving way to panic. She ran back down the sidewalk, looking in every yard, calling out, her voice getting higher and more desperate with each step. But Katie was gone, and the clock that had been counting down all morning, through breakfast and pigtails and promises and laughter, had finally reached 0. Amy Patterson would replay those seconds for the rest of her life. She was standing at the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, doing exactly what her parents had taught her. Look left, look right, look left again. The street was empty, no cars, no movement, just the shimmering heat rising from the asphalt and the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere blocks away. "Okay, it's clear," she said over her shoulder. She turned to reach for Katie's hand, but there was no hand to reach for. The sidewalk behind her was empty. For a moment, maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3, Amy's brain couldn't process what she was seeing. Katie had been right there, right behind her, close enough that Amy could hear her breathing, could hear the soft shuffle of her sneakers on the concrete. "Katie," Amy called out, her voice small and uncertain. Nothing. She turned in a full circle, her eyes scanning the street, the yards, the space between the houses. There was nowhere to hide. The sidewalk was a straight line stretching back toward the Patterson house. There were no alleys, no bushes tall enough to conceal a child, no open doors or gates. "Katie, this isn't funny." Amy's voice was louder now, tinged with something she didn't have a name for yet. Not quite fear, not quite anger, something in between. She started walking back down the sidewalk, then jogging, then running. Her heart was beating faster, a tight feeling building in her chest. She checked every yard she passed, the Millers with the flower garden, the Hendersons with the truck in the driveway. She called Katie's name again and again, her voice cracking. Maybe Katie had run back to get her backpack. Maybe she'd gone inside to use the bathroom. Maybe she was playing a game, hiding somewhere, about to jump out and laugh. But Amy knew, somewhere deep in the part of her brain that understood before the rest of her did, that something was wrong. Katie wouldn't play a game like this. Katie didn't like hide and seek when it meant being alone. By the time Amy reached the Patterson house, she was crying. Not the theatrical tears of a scraped knee or a denied request, but the breathless, hiccuping sobs of genuine panic. "Mom!" she screamed, bursting through the front door. "Mom, Katie's gone." Betty Patterson was still on the phone in the kitchen, laughing at something her sister had said. The sound of Amy's voice cut through the conversation like a blade. "Hold on," Betty said into the receiver, her smile already fading. She set the phone down and met her daughter in the hallway. "What do you mean, gone?" "She was right behind me, and then she wasn't." Amy was sobbing now, her words barely intelligible. "We were going to the store, and I looked both ways, and when I turned around, she was gone." Betty felt her stomach drop. She grabbed Amy by the shoulders. Where were you?" "Maple and 3rd. The corner." She was right there. Betty ran outside, still in her house slippers, her heart hammering. She ran to the corner, calling Katie's name, her voice carrying down the empty street. She checked behind trees, behind parked cars, in open garages. She ran back to her house, checked the backyard, the side yard, under the porch. Nothing. By 9:47, just 10 minutes after Katie had vanished, Betty was back inside, her hands shaking as she picked up the phone. She stared at the receiver for a moment, trying to find the words for what she was about to say. How do you tell a mother that her child has disappeared? She dialed the Reynolds number. Her fingers felt numb. The phone rang once. Twice. "Hello." Susan's voice was bright, unsuspecting. "Susan, it's Betty." Her voice cracked. I don't know how to say this." There was a pause. Susan's tone changed instantly, sharpening with alarm. "What's wrong?" "Katie and Amy were playing outside, and I looked away for just a minute, and now I can't find Katie." The words came out in a rush. "I've looked everywhere. She's not here. She's just gone." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It stretched out for 3 seconds, 4, 5, an eternity compressed into a handful of heartbeats. When Susan finally spoke, her voice was small and strange, as if it belonged to someone else. "What do you mean you can't find her?" "She was right there, Susan, right in front of the house. And then she was gone." "I'm so sorry. I'm calling the police right now." Susan didn't say goodbye. She simply dropped the phone. Betty could hear the clatter of it hitting the kitchen counter, and then nothing. Susan Reynolds stood frozen in her kitchen, her hand still outstretched where the phone had been. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the walls pressing in. Her legs felt weak, insubstantial, as if they might give out at any moment. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself, her knuckles turning white. Katie was at Amy's. She was playing. She was supposed to be home at 1 o'clock. The thought repeated in her mind like a broken record, fighting against what Betty had just told her. There had to be a mistake. Children didn't just disappear. Not in Cardville. Not in broad daylight. Not Katie. But even as she thought it, she was moving. Her body knew before her mind fully caught up. She ran to the front door, not bothering with shoes, not grabbing her purse or keys. She ran out into the street in her bare feet, the hot pavement burning against her skin. She ran the 3 houses down to the Patterson home, her breath coming in gasps, her vision blurring with tears she didn't remember starting to cry. Betty was in the front yard, still calling Katie's name. When she saw Susan, her face crumpled. "Where is she?" Susan's voice was raw, desperate. "Where's my daughter?" "I don't know. I swear, Susan, I don't know." 1 second she was there, and the next. Susan didn't wait for her to finish. She ran to the corner where Betty said the girls had been. She called Katie's name until her throat ached. She searched yards and porches and spaces too small for a child to fit. She looked in places that made no logical sense because logic had abandoned her the moment she'd heard Betty's voice on the phone. Other neighbors were starting to emerge now, drawn by the sound of Susan's screams. Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Miller, the teenage boy from 2 doors down. They spread out, searching, calling, their voices overlapping in a desperate chorus. But Katie Reynolds was nowhere. And somewhere inside Susan's chest, in the space where certainty and safety used to live, something broke clean in half. A fracture that would remain, even decades later, even after the impossible miracle that would eventually bring her daughter home. By 10:15 a.m., Maple Street had transformed into something unrecognizable. Cars blocked the middle of the road, abandoned by neighbors who'd heard the screaming and come running. Children's bicycles lay on their sides in front yards. Screen doors stood open, and everywhere, there were people calling Katie's name, their voices overlapping into a discordant chorus of desperation. The Cardville Police Department consisted of 4 men, Chief Wallace, 2 officers, and a part-time dispatcher. They were accustomed to handling bar fights, traffic violations, and the occasional domestic dispute. They were not prepared for this. Chief Wallace arrived at 10:22, his uniform shirt already dark with sweat. He found Susan Reynolds in the middle of the street, barefoot and wild-eyed, refusing to stop searching long enough to give him a coherent statement. "Mrs. Reynolds, I need you to tell me exactly what happened," he said, his voice firm but gentle. Susan's words came out in fragments, broken by sobs. She was playing Amy's house, just 3 doors down. She's 6 years old, yellow shirt with a rainbow. Tom Reynolds arrived 17 minutes later, his work truck screeching to a halt at the curb. Someone from the grain elevator had called him. He'd driven through 2 red lights getting home, his mind unable to process the words he'd heard on the phone. When he saw Susan, he understood immediately that the nightmare was real. By 11 a.m., the search had expanded beyond Maple Street. Volunteers, more than 100 of them, fanned out across Cardville in a widening grid. They searched backyards, checked empty buildings, knocked on doors of people who'd been at work all morning. They walked through the woods at the edge of town, calling Katie's name until their voices gave out. But there was nothing. No sign of struggle. No witnesses. No clues. Detective Silas Vance arrived from the county sheriff's office at noon. He was a man in his mid-40s with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. He'd worked missing persons cases before, runaways mostly, a few custody disputes, but never anything like this. Never a child who'd vanished in seconds from a residential street in broad daylight. He set up a command post in the Reynolds' living room, transforming their home into the nerve center of the investigation. The coffee table disappeared under maps and notepads. The phone rang constantly. And through it all, Susan sat on the couch, motionless, staring at nothing. "We need a recent photograph," Vance said quietly to Tom. "The most recent one you have." Tom's hands shook as he pulled the school picture from its frame. Katie's gap-toothed smile frozen in time, taken just 3 months earlier. By 1 p.m., the time Katie had promised to be home, roadblocks had been set up on every highway leading out of Cardville. State police stopped cars, checked trunks, questioned drivers. A helicopter circled overhead, its rotors beating the air, searching the surrounding farmland with thermal imaging cameras. The early theories came and went like waves. Maybe she'd wandered off and gotten lost. But Katie knew the neighborhood. She wasn't the kind of child who wandered. Maybe she'd been hit by a car, and the driver panicked. But there was no blood, no skid marks, no physical evidence. Maybe she'd been taken by someone she knew. But everyone on Maple Street had been accounted for, questioned, cleared. By 3 p.m., the FBI had been called. This was now a federal case. The agents arrived with equipment, protocols, and a grim efficiency that made the locals feel both relieved and terrified. If the FBI was here, that meant this was serious. That meant Katie might not be coming home. Search dogs arrived at 4:30. German shepherds trained to track scents, their handlers leading them through the neighborhood. They picked up Katie's trail from the Patterson house, followed it to the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, and then, nothing. The dogs circled, confused, whining. It was as if Katie had simply lifted off the ground and disappeared into thin air. Vance watched the dogs with a growing sense of dread. In his experience, when a trail went cold that quickly, it meant one of 2 things. Either the child had gotten into a vehicle, or something far worse had happened. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Maple Street, the volunteers were still searching. Flashlights bobbed in the darkness like fireflies. Voices, hoarse now, continued to call Katie's name. But the urgency was starting to give way to something else, a creeping, suffocating realization that she might not be found. Not today. Maybe not ever. Tom and Susan Reynolds sat in their living room, surrounded by police officers and FBI agents, and tried to answer questions they'd already answered a dozen times. Did Katie seem upset this morning? No. Had she mentioned anyone new? Anyone who made her uncomfortable? No. Is there anyone, family member, neighbor, acquaintance, who might want to take her? No. 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 At 9:47 p.m., 12 hours after Katie had vanished, Susan walked upstairs to her daughter's bedroom. She stood in the doorway, looking at the unmade bed, the stuffed animals lined up on the windowsill, the ladybug jars catching the moonlight. She walked to Katie's bed and picked up the pillow, pressing it to her face, breathing in the scent of her daughter's shampoo. And then, for the first time since Betty's phone call, she let herself break completely. Tom found her there 20 minutes later, curled on Katie's bed, clutching the pillow, making sounds he'd never heard a human being make before. Downstairs, Vance stood at the window, watching the searchers' lights moving through the darkness. He'd been a detective for 19 years. He'd seen terrible things, but something about this case felt different. The complete absence of evidence. The impossibility of it. A child doesn't just vanish. But Katie Reynolds had. And as the first night without her stretched on, dark and endless and full of unanswered questions, Cardville, Missouri learned what it felt like when safety became a lie, when certainty crumbled, when the worst thing imaginable became real. The first week after Katie disappeared, hope felt like adrenaline, sharp, urgent, electric. The second week, it felt like determination. By the third week, hope had become something heavier, something that required effort to carry. By the first month, it felt like drowning. Tom Reynolds stopped going to work 3 days after Katie vanished. He'd tried. He'd gotten dressed, driven to the grain elevator, stood in the parking lot with his hand on the door handle. But he couldn't make himself go inside. How could he weigh grain and make small talk about the weather when his daughter was out there somewhere, waiting for him to find her? Instead, he drove. Every day, he got in his truck at dawn and drove through neighboring towns, Springfield, Branson, Joplin, anywhere within a 200-mile radius. He carried a box of flyers in the passenger seat, Katie's school picture reproduced 1,000 times over. Missing, Katie Reynolds. Age 6. Last seen June 13, 1981. He taped them to telephone poles and grocery store bulletin boards. He handed them to gas station attendants and waitresses. He stopped strangers on the street, showing them his daughter's face, asking if they'd seen her, watching hope drain from their eyes when they said no. At home, Susan existed in a state of suspended animation. She moved through the house like a ghost, performing the motions of living without actually being alive. She made meals she didn't eat. She washed clothes that didn't get dirty. And every morning, she climbed the stairs to Katie's bedroom and stood in the doorway, unable to cross the threshold but unable to walk away. The room remained exactly as Katie had left it on the morning of June 13th. The bed was unmade, the sheets still wrinkled where Katie had kicked them off. The ladybug jars sat on the windowsill, their tiny occupants long dead, their bodies like dark seeds at the bottom of the glass. Susan couldn't bring herself to empty them. They were the last things Katie had touched, the last evidence of her daughter's life in this house. Mr. Whiskers, the stuffed rabbit that had been left behind on the Pattersons' porch, now sat on Katie's pillow like a sentinel, its button eyes reflecting the light that filtered through the window. Detective Silas Vance came by the house every few days in those early months, his face growing more haggard with each visit. He had no new information, no leads, no breaks in the case. But he kept coming anyway, because he couldn't bear the look in Susan's eyes when she asked, "Have you found anything?" The investigation had consumed every resource the Cardville Police Department had. They'd interviewed over 300 people. They'd searched abandoned buildings, drained the old quarry on the edge of town, combed through miles of forest. They'd built profiles and timelines and theories, but every path led to a dead end. And then, slowly, inevitably, the attention began to fade. The news vans that had camped out on Maple Street for weeks packed up and left. The volunteers who'd searched every day drifted back to their normal lives. The phone calls from reporters stopped coming. By the end of the summer, Katie's case had been moved from the active investigation pile to cold case, a phrase that made Susan physically ill. But worse than the fading attention was what it left behind: suspicion. In a small town where everyone knew everyone, the absence of answers bred paranoia. People started looking at their neighbors differently. The hardware store owner who'd always been a little too friendly with children. The quiet bachelor who lived alone near the elementary school. Even people within the Reynolds' own circle weren't immune. Tom heard the whispers at the gas station. You know, statistically, it's usually the parents. Susan felt the stares at the grocery store, saw the way people crossed the street to avoid talking to her. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know what to say. Amy Patterson's family moved away 6 months after Katie disappeared. Betty couldn't live on Maple Street anymore. Couldn't drive past the corner where everything had gone wrong. The for sale sign in their yard felt like another death. By June 13, 1982, the first anniversary, the yellow ribbons that had been tied around the oak trees on Maple Street were tattered and bleached by the sun. The vigil at the town square drew 40 people instead of 400. The local newspaper ran a small article on page 3. Katie Reynolds. 1 year later, still no answers. Tom and Susan stood in their living room that night, holding each other, crying until they had nothing left. We should move, Tom said quietly. It was the first time he'd said it out loud, though the thought had been there for months. We could go somewhere else. Start over. Susan pulled away from him, her eyes fierce. What if she comes back and we're not here? What if she escapes and she comes home and there's a for sale sign instead of us? Tom had no answer to that. So they stayed. The years accumulated like dust. 1983, 1985, 1988. Each June 13th brought a smaller vigil, fewer news stories, more distance between the town and the memory of a little girl in a yellow rainbow shirt. By 1991, the 10-year mark, Katie's missing poster had been replaced in store windows by advertisements for new products. The case file sat in a box in the basement of the police station. Vance, now graying and worn, still kept Katie's school picture in his desk drawer, but he'd long ago stopped expecting answers. Susan still climbed the stairs to Katie's bedroom every morning. The ladybug jars were covered in dust now, thick and undisturbed. The stuffed animals had faded in the sunlight, but nothing had been moved. Nothing had been changed. Tom worked again. He had to. They needed the money, but he was a different man. Quieter. Hollowed out. He still carried one of Katie's flyers in his wallet, the paper soft and creased from being unfolded and refolded 1,000 times. They celebrated no birthdays. They put up no Christmas decorations. They existed in a house that had become a tomb, waiting for a resurrection they no longer believed would come. But they stayed. Because hope, even when it's heavy enough to crush you, is impossible to fully let go. 300 miles away from Maple Street, in a secluded farmhouse outside Springfield, a girl named Nora was learning to read. She sat at a worn kitchen table, her finger tracing the words in a book about birds, while the man she called Dad watched from across the room. Arthur Sterling was a thin man with graying hair and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He was patient with her, never raising his voice, always encouraging. Sound it out, he said softly. You can do it. Nora had no memory of the corner where Katie Reynolds had vanished. She had no memory of the yellow rainbow shirt or the pink backpack or Mr. Whiskers. What she had instead were fragments, images that felt more like dreams than memories, sensations without context. Sometimes, late at night, she would smell pancakes that weren't there. She would see flashes of blue shutters, hear the creak of a tire swing, feel phantom pigtails swaying against her shoulders. But when she tried to hold on to these images, they slipped away like smoke. Arthur had an explanation for everything. You were very young when it happened, he told her when she was 8 years old, sitting on the porch watching fireflies. There was a fire. Your parents, your birth parents, they didn't make it out. I was driving by, and I saw the flames. I pulled you from the house just before it collapsed. Nora looked up at him with wide eyes. Did it hurt? You don't remember because your mind protected you from the trauma, Arthur said, his voice heavy with something that sounded like grief. Sometimes our brains do that. They hide the things that are too painful to remember. It made sense to Nora. It explained the gaps in her memory, the strange flashes of images that didn't connect to anything real. She'd been rescued from fire. She'd been saved. She never questioned why there were no photographs from before. No birth certificate she could find. No stories about her mother's laugh or her father's hands. Arthur said the fire had taken everything. The farmhouse was isolated, surrounded by fields and woods, the nearest neighbor a mile away. Arthur homeschooled Nora, teaching her from books he brought home from library sales and thrift stores. Math, history, science. She learned it all at that kitchen table, her world contained within the walls of a house that felt safe, but somehow incomplete. There was no television. Arthur said it was too full of violence and noise, that it would corrupt her mind. The radio played classical music and farming reports, nothing more. Newspapers were forbidden, too depressing, too focused on tragedy. Nora's only connection to the outside world came through books. She read voraciously, devouring stories of other places, other lives. Sometimes Arthur would take her on supervised trips to neighboring towns, always keeping her close, always watching. She learned to recognize the signs that meant they needed to leave quickly. The way his jaw would tighten if someone looked at her too long, the subtle pressure of his hand on her shoulders steering her back to the truck. People can be dangerous, he told her once. The world took your parents from you. I won't let it take you too. As Nora grew older, the dream memories became more frequent, but no less confusing. She would wake in the middle of the night with the taste of orange juice in her mouth. She would hear a woman's voice calling a name, not Nora, something else, something that started with a K. But when she tried to remember, the sound would dissolve. She asked Arthur about it when she was 12. Am I remembering things wrong? Sometimes I see things that don't make sense. Arthur's face went pale. He was quiet for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly as he set down his coffee cup. The mind is a complicated thing, he said finally. Sometimes it creates false memories to fill in the gaps. What you're seeing, those aren't real memories, Nora. They're your brain trying to invent a past because the real one is too painful. She wanted to believe him. She did believe him, because the alternative was impossible. Arthur was her father. He'd saved her. He'd raised her. He'd given her everything. But at night, alone in her room, Nora would press her hands against her chest and feel something wrong inside her. A hollow space. A missing piece she couldn't name. By the time Nora was 16, she'd learned to stop asking questions. She helped Arthur with the farm work, cooked meals, kept the house clean. She read everything she could find, teaching herself things Arthur's curriculum didn't cover. And she lived with the persistent, nagging feeling that she was somehow living in the wrong life. Arthur grew older, more fragile. His hair turned completely white. His hands shook when he tried to write. But his devotion to Nora never wavered. He watched over her with an intensity that felt like both protection and imprisonment, though Nora couldn't articulate why it felt that way. You're all I have, he told her one evening, his voice thick with emotion. You know that, don't you? You're my whole world. Nora hugged him, feeling the frailty of his body, the weight of his need. I know, Dad. I know. But the dream memories persisted. The blue shutters. The smell of pancakes. A woman's voice calling out, sharp, urgent, full of love. And a name she could never quite hear. When Arthur died suddenly of a heart attack in the spring of 2008, Nora was 24 years old. She found him in the garden, collapsed among the tomato plants, his face peaceful. The grief was immediate and overwhelming. He was the only family she'd ever known. The only constant in a life that had always felt slightly off-kilter, like a picture hanging crooked on a wall. But beneath the grief was something else, something Nora didn't want to name. A small, terrible whisper in the back of her mind that sounded like relief. For 3 months after Arthur's death, Nora moved through the farmhouse like a sleepwalker, sorting through a lifetime of accumulated belongings. Each room held memories. The kitchen table where she'd learned to read, the porch where they'd watched fireflies, the garden where she'd found him collapsed among the tomatoes. The house was hers now. Arthur had left no will, but there was no one else to claim it. She'd considered selling it, moving somewhere new, starting fresh. But where would she go? She had no family, no friends, no connection to the world beyond these walls. Arthur had been her entire universe, and now that universe had contracted to nothing. It was late September when Nora finally forced herself to tackle the attic. She climbed the narrow stairs with a box of garbage bags and a determination to purge the accumulated debris of decades. The attic was thick with dust and heat, the air stale and heavy. Cardboard boxes were stacked against the walls, labeled in Arthur's precise handwriting. Taxes 1987 to 1992. Farm equipment manuals. Books donated. Nora worked methodically, opening boxes, sorting contents, throwing away what was useless. Old receipts. broken tools, photographs of people she didn't recognize. Arthur as a younger man, standing alone in various locations, always alone. She was 3 hours into the work when she found the cedar chest. It was pushed into the corner beneath the eaves, hidden behind a stack of boxes that looked like they hadn't been moved in years. The chest itself was old but well made, with brass hinges and a heavy padlock securing the lid. Nora stared at it for a long moment, her heart suddenly beating faster for reasons she couldn't name. Everything else in the attic had been accessible, unremarkable. This was the only thing locked away, the only thing hidden. She found a crowbar in the barn and pried the lock off. The metal shrieked in protest, then gave way with a sharp crack. Nora lifted the lid slowly, her hands trembling. Inside, beneath layers of old blankets, were clothes. Children's clothes. Nora's breath caught in her throat. She reached in with shaking hands and pulled out the first item, a yellow t-shirt, faded with age, with a rainbow stretched across the front. The world tilted. She knew this shirt, not from memory exactly, but from something deeper, cellular recognition, a knowing that bypassed conscious thought. Her hands traced the rainbow, and suddenly she wasn't in the attic anymore. She was 6 years old, pulling this shirt over her head, excited about the day ahead. She could feel it, the fabric against her skin, the way it was slightly too big, the pride she'd felt wearing it. Nora's hands dove back into the chest. Denim shorts with embroidered flowers on the pockets. White sneakers with Velcro straps. A pink backpack, small and worn. And underneath everything, wrapped in tissue paper, a stuffed rabbit with one ear that flopped more than the other. The rabbit. The name came to her unbidden, Mr. Whiskers. Nora's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the attic floor, the yellow shirt clutched in her hands, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The dream memories that had haunted her for years suddenly weren't dreams at all. They were real. They were hers. She saw blue shutters, a tire swing, a kitchen table with pancakes, a woman with kind eyes brushing her hair, a man calling her. Not Nora. Katie. Katie Reynolds, come home for lunch. 1 o'clock sharp. The voice in her memory was so clear it could have been in the room with her. Nora sat in that attic for 2 hours, holding the yellow shirt, her mind simultaneously shattering and reassembling itself into a new, terrible shape. Arthur hadn't saved her from a fire. Arthur had taken her. Everything, every story, every explanation, every moment of her life had been a lie. The next morning, Nora drove to the public library in Springfield. Her hands were still shaking as she signed up for computer access. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses on a chain, asked if she needed help. "I'm fine," Nora said, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. She sat at the computer terminal, staring at the search bar. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Katie Reynolds. Missing. Missouri. 1981. She hit enter. The screen loaded slowly, the old computer grinding through its processes. And then, there it was, the first result from a missing persons database. A grainy black and white photograph. A little girl with strawberry blonde pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. The caption read, Katie Reynolds. Missing since June 13, 1981. Last seen, Cardville, Missouri. Nora stared at the screen, at the face that was her own face, 28 years younger. At the smile she recognized from the mirror. At the eyes that had looked back at her every day of her life. She clicked to the next page. There was more, a full case summary. The circumstances of her disappearance. The massive search effort. The FBI involvement. And at the bottom, contact information for Detective Silas Vance, Cardville Police Department. Still listed. Still active. Still waiting for information after nearly 3 decades. Nora's hand moved to her mouth. She thought she might be sick. She thought she might scream. She thought she might shatter into pieces right there in the library. Her parents hadn't died in a fire. They were alive. They had been alive this entire time, 300 miles away, waiting for her. And she hadn't known. She hadn't known. The librarian glanced over at her. "Are you all right, dear?" Nora couldn't answer. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. She walked out of the library on legs that didn't feel like her own, got into her truck, and drove back to the farmhouse in a daze. She sat in the driveway for a long time, staring at the house where she'd been raised. The place that had felt like safety and imprisonment in equal measure. The walls that had hidden the truth of who she was. Inside, The cedar chest still sat open in the attic. The yellow shirt was on the floor where she'd dropped it. And somewhere in Cardville, Missouri, a family she couldn't remember had spent 28 years waiting for their daughter to come home. Nora pulled out her cell phone, another recent acquisition after Arthur's death, something he never would have allowed. With trembling fingers, she dialed the number for the Cardville Police Department. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and then a voice answered. Cardville Police, Detective Vance speaking. Nora opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Hello, Vance said. Is anyone there? She forced the words out, her voice barely a whisper. I think I'm Katie Reynolds. Detective Silas Vance had received his share of false leads over 28 years. Psychics claiming to have visions. Conspiracy theorists with elaborate theories. Well-meaning but mistaken witnesses who thought they'd seen Katie Reynolds in a grocery store in another state. So when the woman on the phone whispered, I think I'm Katie Reynolds, his first instinct was to sigh and reach for his standard script for handling these calls. But something in her voice stopped him. Ma'am, he said carefully, I need you to tell me why you think that. There was a long pause. Then, I found a yellow t-shirt with a rainbow and denim shorts with flowers. And I remember a tire swing, blue shutters, pancakes, a woman telling me to be home by 1 o'clock. Vance's hand tightened on the phone. Those details had never been released to the public. The shirt, yes, that had been in the missing person report. But the tire swing? The blue shutters? The 1 o'clock promise? What's your name? He asked, his voice suddenly urgent. Nora Sterling. But that's not my real name, is it? Vance was already pulling the Reynolds file from his desk drawer. Katie's school photo, faded after nearly 3 decades, paperclipped to the front. Miss Sterling, I need you to stay exactly where you are. Can you do that? Can you give me an address? She did. A farmhouse outside Springfield, 300 miles away from Cardville. 300 miles away from where she'd vanished on a summer morning in 1981. I'm coming to you, Vance said. Don't go anywhere. Don't talk to anyone. Do you understand? Yes. Her voice was small, broken. I understand. Vance made 3 phone calls in rapid succession. The Missouri State Police, the FBI field office, and then, with shaking hands, he dialed a number he knew by heart. Tom Reynolds answered on the second ring. Hello. Tom, it's Silas Vance. There was a pause. Vance had called periodically over the years, on anniversaries, when new leads emerged, always with nothing to report. Tom's voice flattened with practiced resignation. Silas. Tom, I need you to sit down. I need you to get Susan. And I need you both to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. The DNA test took 4 days. 4 days of Nora living in a hotel room in Springfield, not trusting herself to stay in the farmhouse, not knowing where else to go. 4 days of Vance driving back and forth, conducting interviews, documenting everything, building the case that would either prove or destroy the most impossible hope he'd ever dared to feel. 4 days of Tom and Susan Reynolds existing in a limbo worse than the previous 28 years. Because now there was possibility, fragile, terrifying, unbearable possibility. What if it's not her? Susan whispered on the 3rd night, sitting at the kitchen table where Katie had eaten her last breakfast in 1981. What if it is? Tom replied, his voice hollow with fear and hope in equal measure. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Vance received the call from the lab. 99.9% match. He sat in his car in the police station parking lot and wept like he hadn't wept since his own daughter was born. Then he drove to Maple Street, to the white house with blue shutters that had stood unchanged for 28 years, and knocked on the door. Susan answered. She took one look at Vance's face and her legs buckled. Tom caught her, held her upright. Is she? Susan couldn't finish the question. She's alive, Vance said, and his voice cracked on the words. It's her, Susan. It's Katie. She's alive, and she's coming home. The reunion was arranged at the police station, neutral ground, private, away from the media frenzy that had already begun. A room with soft lighting, comfortable chairs, and a box of tissues that everyone knew would be inadequate. Nora, Katie, arrived first, driven by a victim services advocate. She sat in a folding chair, her hands knotted together, her whole body vibrating with terror. She was 34 years old. She had no memory of the people she was about to meet. No conscious recollection of their faces, or voices, or love. But when the door opened and Susan Reynolds stepped through, something in Katie's chest recognized her before her mind did. Susan stopped 3 feet inside the doorway. She was 59 years old now, her hair gray, her face marked by nearly 3 decades of grief. She looked at the woman sitting in the chair, a stranger with familiar eyes, and made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Tom stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, his face wet with tears he wasn't bothering to wipe away. "Katie." Susan's voice was barely audible. Katie stood slowly. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Mom." The word, one syllable, barely a whisper, shattered what was left of Susan's composure. She crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled Katie into her arms with a force that should have knocked them both over. Katie stiffened for a fraction of a second. 28 years of being Nora, of not knowing this woman, of having no context for this embrace. But then her body remembered what her mind had forgotten. The smell of Susan's perfume, unchanged after all these years. The particular way she held on, arms wrapped tight, one hand cradling the back of Katie's head. The sound of her breathing, ragged with sobs. Katie's arms came up slowly, then suddenly, clutching her mother with the desperation of someone who'd been drowning without knowing it. "I'm sorry." Katie sobbed into her mother's shoulder. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't remember." "Shoo." Susan was crying too hard to say much else. "You're here. You're here now. That's all that matters." Tom approached slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might shatter the moment. He touched Katie's shoulder, tentative, gentle. When she turned to look at him, he saw the gap-toothed 6-year-old superimposed over the 34-year-old woman. "Pumpkin," he whispered. Katie let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You call me Pumpkin." "Every day," Tom said. "Every single day for 28 years. They held each other, the 3 of them, in that small room, while Vance stood outside the door with his hand over his mouth, giving them this moment, this impossible, miraculous moment. 28 years. 10,220 days. 245,280 hours. And in a single embrace, all of it, every day of waiting, every hour of grief, every minute of hope that refused to die, collapsed into now. Katie Reynolds had come home. The hardest part wasn't the reunion. It was everything that came after. For the first 3 months, Katie lived in a hotel. Not because her parents didn't want her home. They desperately did. But because she needed space to process the incomprehensible fact that she was simultaneously a 34-year-old woman and a 6-year-old girl who'd never come home. She met with a trauma specialist twice a week. Dr. Sarah Chun had worked with kidnapping survivors before, but she'd never encountered a case quite like Katie's. "You're grieving multiple losses at once," Dr. Chun explained during their 4th session. "You're grieving the childhood you lost, the parents you didn't remember, but you're also grieving Arthur, the man who stole your life but was the only father you ever knew. Both things can be true. Both grief and anger can exist in the same space." Katie sat with her arms wrapped around herself, trying to hold together a sense of self that kept fracturing and reforming. "I loved him," she whispered. "How can I love someone who did that to me?" "Because he was all you had," Dr. Chun said gently. "And because love doesn't follow logic. It doesn't make him less guilty, and it doesn't make you wrong for feeling what you feel." The question of her name became unexpectedly complicated. Legally, she was Katie Reynolds, always had been. But she'd been Nora Sterling for 28 years. That name had shaped her, defined her, belonged to her in ways Katie never had. She settled on a compromise, Katie Reynolds on official documents, but Nora in her own mind when she needed to remember that the years between 6 and 34 weren't wasted. They were survival. They were life. They counted. For months after the reunion, Katie finally returned to Maple Street. The house looked smaller than her dream memories suggested, but the blue shutters were exactly right. Tom and Susan stood on the porch, giving her space to approach at her own pace. Katie climbed the steps slowly. The tire swing was gone. Tom had taken it down years ago when the rope rotted, but she could see where it had hung, the branch worn smooth by decades of use. Susan opened the front door. "Would you like to see your room?" Katie nodded, unable to speak. The stairs creaked in a way that triggered something primal in her. The hallway smelled like old wood and the lavender sachets Susan put in closets. And then they were standing in the doorway of the bedroom that time had forgotten. The bed was still unmade, exactly as she'd left it on June 13th, 1981. The ladybug jars sat on the windowsill, their tiny inhabitants long dead, transformed into dust. And there, on the pillow, was Mr. Whiskers. Katie crossed the room and picked up the stuffed rabbit. Its fur was faded, one ear still flopped more than the other. She pressed it to her chest, and finally, let herself remember everything. The sprinkler, Amy's laugh, the quarters in her hand, the corner where the world had changed. She sat on the edge of the bed and cried for the little girl who'd skipped out the door that morning with a promise she couldn't keep. Recovery wasn't linear. There were good days and terrible days and days when Katie woke up not knowing which name felt right. She joined a support group for long-term abduction survivors. She learned that healing wasn't about forgetting or getting over it. It was about integrating the fractures into something whole. By 2012, 3 years after her return, Katie had enrolled in college. She was 37 years old, sitting in classrooms with 19-year-olds, feeling ancient and newborn at the same time. She studied social work with a fierce determination that surprised her professors. "I want to help people who've lost themselves," she explained to her advisor. "People who are trying to figure out who they are after trauma." Her case had sparked legislative changes. The Katie Reynolds Protocol, signed into law in 2011, mandated better cross-jurisdictional sharing of missing persons data and more sophisticated age progression technology. It wouldn't bring back the years she'd lost, but it might save someone else's child. Katie moved into her own apartment in 2013, not far from Maple Street, but separate, necessary. She needed to prove to herself that she could build a life that was entirely her own, chosen rather than stolen or reclaimed. But every Sunday, she went home for breakfast. Susan still made pancakes. Tom still drank too much coffee and told stories about the farmers at the grain elevator. And Katie, sometimes Nora, sometimes both, increasingly just herself, sat at the kitchen table and let herself belong. She met Julian in 2014 at a community event. He was a high school teacher, quiet and patient, who didn't press her for details she wasn't ready to share. Their first date was coffee. Their second was a walk through the park. By the third, she told him everything. "I need you to know that I'm still figuring out who I am," she said. "Some days I feel like I'm 39. Some days I feel like I'm 6. Most days I'm somewhere in between." Julian took her hand. "I'm not in love with who you were or who you might have been. I'm in love with who you are right now, today." It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. By 2015, Katie had her degree and was working at a nonprofit that supported families of missing children. She facilitated support groups, helped parents navigate the impossible space between hope and grief, and used her story to remind them that miracles, however rare, were possible. Tom and Susan aged gracefully into their 70s, finally allowing themselves to live in the present tense instead of the past. The house on Maple Street, with its blue shutters and memorial bedroom that Katie had gently converted into a guest room, became a place of life again instead of a shrine to loss. On June 13, 2019, 38 years after Katie disappeared, the family gathered on Maple Street for a private ceremony. They planted an oak tree in the front yard, its roots reaching deep into the soil where the tire swing used to hang. "For the years we lost," Susan said, her hand in Tom's. "And the years we found," Katie added, her hand in Julian's. The tree would grow slowly, year by year, its branches eventually providing shade for generations not yet born. It wouldn't erase what happened. Nothing could. But it would stand as testament to the fact that survival is possible, that broken families can heal, that stolen time can never be reclaimed, but new time can be built. Katie Reynolds' story didn't have a perfect ending, because perfect endings don't exist in real life. What it had instead was continuation, a life rebuilt, a self-reclaimed, a family that refused to let darkness have the final word. And on Maple Street, beneath the oak trees that had watched it all unfold, the blue shutters remained, a quiet promise that some things endure, even when everything else falls apart. Home isn't a place you can never leave. Sometimes, it's the place you spend 28 years finding your way back to. And sometimes, impossibly, against every odd, you make it. If this story affected you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share Katie's story with others. Every share increases awareness, and awareness can save lives. Thank you for watching, and remember, she was missing for 28 years, but she was never truly gone.